WABE in Atlanta, broadcasting live from the Atlanta History Center. This is Closer Look. I am Rose Scott. And I also want to go ahead and bring out our guests because they are extraordinary. I'll read their bios in just a second, but I want to welcome from Georgia State University two outstanding professors, Professor Tiffany Player, Professor Elizabeth West, and from Oglethorpe University, she's the Director of Diversity, Equity, and all that good stuff, Dr. Laura Renee Chandler. Now, even though we live, I'm still be the same Rose. Someone said to me, "You have all women." And I said, "Wait a minute. You would never say that if it was all men." That person's in the audience. I'm not going to call them out because my boss is here and I want to have a job come Tuesday. But that's part of the whole conversation too, right? Who gets to tell stories, right? So let's all sit down. Let's talk about Juneteenth. Professor Player, I want to start with you because we had this conversation, maybe a year ago, and we were talking about Juneteenth, and I remember asking you, what do you think people often get wrong about Juneteenth and what it really is and what really happened?
Thank you for having me. Juneteenth is a celebration, right? But it's a complicated celebration. The actual historical event was June 19th, 1865, when Major General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, with more than 1,800 members of the Union Army, many of them who were U.S. colored troops, so African-American men who were serving to kind of liberate themselves and others from bondage. And they arrived in Galveston, Texas to kind of try to liberate those from bondage and let them know that slavery was over. And one of the things that is really important for us to remember about Juneteenth is that the enslaved people who heard this, proclamation by General Granger were aware that the Civil War was, had ended, that General Lee had surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. So it's important for us to remember that Juneteenth comes more than 2 months after the Confederate Army surrendered in the Civil War. And that proclamation was issued to people who were held in bondage by those, for more than 2 months, by those who wanted to perpetuate the institution of slavery. And so I think that that's a really important thing for us to always keep in mind as we're kind of celebrating this important federal holiday now, as of last year, but celebrating this important moment in U.S. history and African-American history. It's always been incredibly complicated.
Speaking of incredibly complicated, what was this? Let's go back then to that time because I'm curious in terms of in Texas. Why was Texas the outlier here?
Texas was the westernmost Confederate state, right? And so as, there were people who were enslaving African Americans who were actually taking them from states like Alabama, from states like Florida into Texas, to kind of try to perpetuate the institution of slavery. So that's a major reason why Texas was an outlier in this process and, was a place in which people were really trying to perpetuate the institution of slavery. And it took the U.S. government more than 2 months after that surrender at Appomattox Courthouse to have the forces to be able to enforce emancipation at the end of the Civil War.
So let me ask you this. When did you learn about this in school?
No.
Did you? Dr. Chandler?
I did not, no.
Did you, Professor West? Anybody out there in the audience learn about this in school? There you have it. Professor West, I want to bring you into the conversation because now we're in this moment of how we should tell history, and especially when we talk to, let's say, elementary or even middle school. Juneteenth is the perfect example of why it's important to accurately tell history and to include everything and not be concerned so much about, are we hurting someone's feelings? Now, I don't want to get too political, but I'll let you get political.
We need to recognize that there is no singular history. There are histories, plural, and the story of this country is a story of multiplicities of experiences. And those experiences extend beyond the perspective of the colonists who were able to defeat their mother country and then create a nation. It is a story of all the other people who were here, and particularly African Americans. So if we're going to tell our history, and that's our plural, meaning the United States as a collective of indigenous people, of African Americans, of European Americans, of the Chinese and Japanese who came later. That's the fullness of our history. And if we aren't willing to tell the fullness of the story, we should at least be honest and say, this is the single story of this nation, starting with George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and that's all we want to tell. Oh. I could live with that, frankly.
Really?
I could live with it. I could live with it, Rose, for the very again question, the question that you asked about how we learned about Juneteenth. Mm-hmm. I didn't need school to tell me about Juneteenth. I learned about Juneteenth in my own community. I learned my history in my own community. I learned about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Heming long before the DNA test.
Yeah.
I'll stop there, but
No, I mean, hey. The live show, I can't do nothing.
But I say that to make the point, and the holiday is important if we want to extend it and share it with the nation, but I want to emphasize that Black people are sharing this holiday. Mm-hmm. This has always been our holiday, and I'm happy to share it, but I think it's important that we acknowledge that it existed before the validation of the federal government.
Let me stay with you for a second, Professor West. Were you surprised then when the United States finally said, okay, Juneteenth will now be except for folk in South Dakota. I don't know what's going on in South Dakota. They got some issues. They are not recognizing Juneteenth. Sheffield is here from Atlanta History Center. Do we need to take a caravan there? I don't know what's happening with South Dakota. But most of all the states are recognizing Juneteenth except South Dakota. Don't ask me why. We'll get them on the show. But were you surprised that finally now we have Juneteenth as a federal holiday?
I wasn't surprised. As I said, I'm excited about it, but in the history of the kind of repair that's needed in this country, Juneteenth is low-hanging fruit.
All right. Professor Player, let's talk then about the politics now of how we are now telling stories, whether it's through divisive concepts or CRT. Your thoughts just on now all of a sudden we're in this space where there's legislation being passed telling educators what they can teach, how they should teach it, and at what age they should teach it, and what they should omit.
Well, Juneteenth, I think, is an ideal opportunity for us to engage these issues because it's fundamentally about the institution of slavery and liberation and the attempts by some to continue the institution of slavery, right? To refuse to accept defeat. And Juneteenth has always been, as Professor West kind of mentioned, I mean, really an important part of a commemoration in African American communities that has a really long tradition, as Professor Chandler mentioned. But one of the things that's really important for us to, kind of consider as we're commemorating this holiday, I mean, I was surprised, actually, that this federal holiday was designated last year, but I wasn't surprised about the rise of opposition to critical race theory or the attempts to control what's being taught in the classroom. I mean, schools have become spaces where people can, and students especially, can ask questions, and schools have been a safe space for students to be able to tackle difficult issues. And so I think kind of in many ways what's happening over the last couple of years is this kind of duality that's always been present in American history and society, where we have some gains and opposition to issues of equality and diversity and equity. Because the more people ask questions, and students, I mean, in my experience, the students have been really eager of all, from all backgrounds to discuss these issues and to be able to learn the skills to sift through all of the noise, all of the information and misinformation that's out there. And so Juneteenth can be an opportunity to really kind of dive deeply into it, because you can't shy away from the fact that it's about the institution of slavery. It's not about states' rights, right? It's not about African Americans not wanting liberation from the institution of slavery, or the uneven ways in which the federal government has protected the rights of African Americans. I mean, Juneteenth has all of that, and it's always been an incredibly inclusive holiday, even when it was celebrated among African American communities. It's been a place to reflect on the past, to think about the present, to honor ancestors, to imagine a future. I mean, and that is absolutely what we need to be doing in our own time. And so Juneteenth is ideal for that.
The way you just presented that, but then when you talk to someone else, someone who's in opposition, and I had a state lawmaker tell me, well, Rose, I don't think that kids should be saddled with guilt and sin from the past. It's a direct quote. So it is. So, Dr. Chandler, I'll ask you then, what would be your response then to that state lawmaker?
Yeah, I don't think that this history, and it really is our history, right? It's a collective history, that it isn't about guilt or about making people feel bad about who they are, that it's a part of our collective legacy within this country. And so if we want to understand where we are today and who we are, we need to understand where we've come from and what has occurred in the past. I really appreciated some of the things that Dr. Player said. It's interesting to me that we put so much emphasis on July the 4th, right, as a nation. But when we think about who we are as citizens, as a collective, that understanding actually is much more tied to the period following the Civil War and emancipation, right? The Revolutionary War era really didn't answer the question of what it means to be a citizen. It didn't answer the question of what does the federal government owe to you as a citizen? Because there wasn't a federal government. It took us some time to figure that out. It wasn't until the post-Civil War period that we were actually able to answer that question. And the reason for that is because we now have 4.5 million formerly enslaved individuals, and the government has to figure out, what are we going to do with these people? What are they owed? And how are we, more importantly, how are we going to keep them safe, and how are we going to protect them? Because they were in an environment that was violently hostile to them. And so, our understanding of who we are actually comes from that moment. And so it's interesting. I would like to see us maybe, find a way to connect Juneteenth and July the 4th, right? Because that's incredibly key to who we are as citizens. And I don't think people should be threatened by that.
Professor West, your response to critics, like the state lawmaker that said that to me, what would your response be?
I would ask that if that's our starting point for thinking about what should be taught and what should not be taught, then we have to open it up to my feelings. So I'm, I try to be flexible. If that's the road we want to go down, if I have to silence my experience of history in this country because it offends a certain sector of the population, let's just say I want to go with that. Well, I want the reciprocal. I want you then to understand that when I sat in a classroom as a child and had to hear that George Washington was the nation's hero, I was offended by that. And I had to struggle with that conflict. I had to struggle with the notion that July 4th comes around and I'm supposed to celebrate, the anniversary of this nation, that I'm supposed to celebrate these patriots who, had no problem with reconciling their major difference, which was slavery, at my expense, at my ancestors' expense. I'm offended by that. I'm hurt by that. I mean, I can use all these, emotional descriptives to talk about my reaction to that. So if we have just reduced history to a matter of what offends you, then I want you to think about what offends me.
We need a clap meter for you, because you just... In Georgia, and divisive concepts means, it's a law, educators cannot teach that America is inherently racist or that a particular race is responsible for racism. That's a fact. I didn't make it up. Just sign into law.
Right, exactly. And I think as citizens, we have to think about what that means. Because again, it means that we live in a society where we have implemented into law the right to silence the ills of the government, the ills of our history. But again, I go back to that previous point. If that's where we want to be, then I again want to say, well, let's have a level playing field. If we can't talk about racism, then we can't talk about George Washington and the Patriots, because that's slanted. That's racist. The very foundation of the documents that we honor were grounded in the idea of silencing, the history of certain peoples, Native Americans and African Americans. So if we want to enact these laws, let's have a level playing field. And then we have to think about where we are after that. We're really at a point after that where we have no history.
Yeah.
If everybody's got to be quiet and unoffended, we have no history.
Chandler, your thoughts on, not just here in Georgia, but many other state legislatures around the nation have passed some type of divisive concepts law?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you mentioned South Dakota. I just came from there. That's where I moved from.
That's
and
right.
I taught at a state institution. in South Dakota.
Is this their way of getting back because you left?
A little bit, yes. And so, you know, I got out of there in time, but they actually passed. That's really how I feel about it. But they, you know, they passed legislation essentially dissolving all of the diversity offices within the entire state. So there are no diversity offices in the state institutions.
Really?
Yes.
Whoa,
In the state of South
that's
Dakota.
a whole nother we got time.
I know.
My show. Let's back up.
Yes.
Why? What was at the core of this decision?
So it was a long process. It was many years of a march leading to that. It started with an intellectual diversity bill, which required state universities to keep track of the speakers that they were bringing to campus, and they had to be able to show that there was a equality in, you know, the views. So if you're bringing progressive speakers, you have to bring an equal amount of conservative speakers. So it started there. It really picked up when the Trump administration passed I think it was an executive order, basically banning trainings about diversity or what they considered insensitive topics. And then, you know, once the conversation about CRT happened, I mean, it just really threw it over the edge. So they've replaced all of those centers with what they call opportunity centers that are meant to support the development of all of the students without addressing their identity, without addressing the groups that they belong to. And I think that is unethical. You know, in the city that I lived in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, in the K through 12 system, over 50% of the students in that system are students of color. They're people of color. And those are students who eventually are going to be in the state institutions. And to eliminate the offices that are meant to celebrate and support and uplift the cultures that these students come from is unethical. It's a deeply unethical decision. So, and I did want to answer the question that you asked. You know, I think that if you are so certain about how right you are and how right your ideas are, then just be willing to put your ideas out there in the marketplace, right? Like, let them compete with other narratives, with other histories, with other ideas. You don't need to pass legislation or laws to silence the other side, right? And that's an indication of the fact that you know that you're wrong and that you can't compete.
It's like being in church, isn't it?
No, this is wonderful.
You should pass the collection plate. Professor Player, legislation that, first of all, when you heard about divisive concepts, what did you think?
I mean, I think it's really an important question for us to ask is why, especially at the elementary and secondary school levels, is why asking our children to identify more with enslavers than the most vulnerable people in a society, the enslaved, is why that's a divisive concept, as opposed to having our students and our children identify more with enslavers who were the founders of our society, right? And I think that is something that isn't being talked about enough. I mean, critics of CRT are, you know, kind of putting out there that they're trying, you know, these divisive concepts, that race is divisive. When you look back at the historical record, I mean, the people who were creating this country to be an exclusive place, a white supremacist place, were very explicit about race. And so even these critics of CRT are not being true to what the people they purport to venerate were about. And I think that is one of the really frustrating things. And so when you're stifling the curiosity of our children and telling them that there are certain things that they can't talk about, or there are certain aspects of their identity that they have to, you know, kind of put aside, or that, you know, making a direct line really between enslavers of the 17th and 18th century to the 21st century, that to me is deeply, deeply problematic. And it's selling our students short. You know, they are interested in kind of learning about the past. And our past is ugly and violent and messy. And that's something that schools can be a place for that kind of really deep intellectual exchange. So discussion needs to be encouraged rather than labeled as divisive.
When we talk about then CRT, because there might be some folks in the audience that don't quite understand what's all this drama about critical race theory. I'm going to ask you, as I've asked people this before, what do folks get wrong about what critical race theory is?
I think the thing that they get wrong, number one, is that it's something new. We've been doing this thing that we label critical race theory for some time now. I mean, at its most fundamental level, critical race theory is just asking us to consider how the otherwise ordinary experiences of American citizens get complicated when we have to consider the matter of race. So if you just think about the everyday experience of every citizen navigating our world, trying to find employment, trying to get an education, trying to look to the future and plan to the future in a world where technology and economics are making us have to reimagine our whole lives and future. That's everybody's experience. Mm-hmm. Now, add the layer of race to there, and then come talk to me. And I can tell you how much more complicated that gets. And what critical race theory is simply asking us to examine is how the matter of race impacts Black people, people of color, minoritized populations, to put them at disadvantages in a system that we presume is otherwise equal. So again, there's nothing magical or new about critical race theory. I've taught it. In fact, when I was trained as a PhD candidate in my field of study, it wasn't called critical race theory. It was just called getting an education. So I think what we have to really do is just get back to the ground level of really acknowledging what constitutes knowledge. Do we want to facilitate knowledge, or do we want to facilitate people's myths? And we need to distinguish between the two.
Dr. Chandler, you have taught critical race theory too, correct?
I have, yes.
What do people get wrong about it?
I wholly reject the way that it is being defined currently in public conversation. I think the people who are the most upset about it and talking about it most frequently have no idea what it is, right? They're using it as a proxy for conversations that they just don't want to have. And so I guess I don't enter the conversation from that point.
Sure.
And I also think that as a historian, as an African-American historian, the field of African-American history has been asking these types of questions for a very, very long time. I mean, even prior to CRT. And so, I think that it's really important that we're more critical about the things that people are trying to silence and trying to shut down, especially with higher education. I mean, it is important that students come into that space, that they're presented with new ideas, that they're presented with the diversity of perspectives and lived experiences. And we know that that's key to student success within college, and it's key to the success that they have once they leave and once they graduate.
I want to stick with you for a moment because there was actually a state lawmaker that had requested with Georgia's Board of Regents, they wanted to know what professors were teaching, anything remotely related to race and again, critical race theory or divisive concepts. And they wanted to know, what speakers are going to be coming and who these professors were going to be bringing into the classroom. You all are at that level. What do you make of that type of movement? Okay, we understand, we don't like it. We understand when folks say elementary, kindergarten, which CRT is not taught. But then when you get to college, when you get to the higher education, now you have lawmakers wanting to know what you're teaching, what book you're teaching from, who you bringing in as speakers.
Mm-hmm.
That's got to be,
Yeah, so I don't think that lawmakers know anything about what it takes to help students succeed in college. And I think they should do their job, and I think that they should leave the job of higher education to those who are committed to it and to the professionals within that field. I think that to come into the classroom, I mean, there are real academic freedom, issues and questions within this, but it's not their lane, and I think to accuse other people of being ideological and politically driven when actually that's what they're doing. They should stay out of the conversation entirely.
Professor Player, lawmakers want to know what y'all doing over there at Georgia State.
I mean, I think it's just thinking about it from the perspective of somebody who cares about educating my students. I want and I strive to create an environment in which students can ask questions, regardless of the background that they come from, and kind of understanding how we all got to this space. And that is a really important process of learning that I think these kind of initiatives that are anti-CRT are mischaracterizing what it is and are kind of trying to control process in a way that does an incredible disservice to not only the professionals who have, dedicated years of service to the profession, but also students. I mean, I think in these last few years, as these issues have become, more in the forefront of our public conversations, I mean, I've had a lot of students from a variety of backgrounds who have said, I'm glad that we're having these conversations. I want to be able to think about how I can respond to people who come at them with really ignorant questions or ideological, kind of statements. They want those tools, and they're looking to us as professionals inside the classroom to be able to help them learn how to navigate the world that we have all inherited. And U.S. history is incredibly complicated and has a racist history and present, and is really, kind of forces us to deal with these issues. And I think students are ready for it, and I think they're capable of asking questions and learning to live in a diverse society, because that's what we have. So help students be better citizens, and that's not kind of towing one ideological line. That is helping them become critical thinkers.
Let's go back then a little bit. Is there an age that you think it is appropriate to start talking about this nation's ugly truths?
I think from the beginning. I think from the beginning, because our children see diversity. They have questions. So don't stymie those questions, or ignore or silence those questions, because that does a disservice to future generations. I mean, because they're ready to try and figure out how we got here, why people look different from them, why there are class differences. And I think that they can ask more honest questions and are ready for more honest answers than some of the adults.
What do you say to some people, and I've had this conversation with parents that say, slavery is just too difficult, too challenging for me to talk to my 6-year-old about? Dr. Chan, what do you think?
I mean, imagine if that was your history, personally, right? If that was your lived experience. I mean, one thing that I tell my students is that, liberation and freedom are not metaphors when you're talking about Black people. They're not analogies. This is very much a part of who we are and what our lived experience has been in this country. And so all of this, talking about Juneteenth and about race and whether it's critical race theory or something else, I mean, this is all a part of being seen and being valued and whose histories we value and who's represented and who's doing the representing. And there's a lot of power in that. And I agree with Dr. Player. I mean, this is something that should begin very early, right? we are, all of us in this room, we are bombarded with messages that are racist, that are sexist, that are patriarchal, that are homophobic, that are transphobic. I mean, every day of our lives, right? Whether you recognize it or not. And it's important. We all have a responsibility to interrupt that cycle, right? Because something that begins as a joke or a stereotype or an insensitive remark, eventually that becomes a belief, it becomes a worldview, it becomes a framework for violence and for marginalization. And so knowing that that is how race works in this country, that's how oppression works in this country, we have to start these conversations very early so that young people are equipped to stop this cycle of oppression.
Yeah. Professor West, a while ago you talked about, you learned about Juneteenth in your community. You know, I remember my dad giving me, I wanted a football, but he gave me a book by Langston Hughes. I'm like, dude, what are you doing? I wanted a football. Read the book. I got the football later, but community is so important. Can you talk about the importance of community and also expectations from institutions like this, the Atlanta History Center and other institutions, to be a part of reaching out to the community, helping tell the accurate story?
I think, and in fact, I've learned this from my own research that I've been in the weeds on for the past 6 years. And in these past 6 years of my current project, I've really come to understand why these kinds of institutions are so important. I've been in archival centers. I've been in courtroom houses where I've had to have just everyday court folks in small towns lead me to documents, and it's important. These are where records are held that help us again to tell that full story. Before I really took this journey on my current project, I was always annoyed professionally with the continued message that students get in the classroom that we can't, we can't really go into much detail about African Americans during enslavement because we just don't have the records. There's just not information out there to tell us. Well, that's not accurate. There's all kinds of information out there, even when they aren't named, even when they, are not acknowledged. The information is there. And I've just been really grateful. I don't know, I can't say that this has been intentional on the part of our country because, perhaps 100 years ago, if they knew people would be combing through the archives finding what they're finding now, maybe they would not have held on to these documents. This kind of, these kinds of institutions are important for us to go back and really to fill out those large holes in the larger puzzle that constitutes who we are.
I want you all to take a couple of minutes to your own personal reflection in terms of Juneteenth and what you hope people, again, we're not telling you what to think or how to think, but what you hope people understand about this federal holiday and in all the history surrounding it.
I think it gives us an opportunity to have more conversations like this, to think about the complicated nature of U.S. history, the centrality of African Americans to U.S. history, the centrality of slavery and the quest for freedom to U.S. history. And I'm hopeful that schools can continue to be a place where those conversations can take place, that centers like the Atlanta History Center and other archival centers can be a space for making those connections with the larger community. And for me, Juneteenth is an ideal American holiday for that reason, because it really kind of captures the essence of the challenges that we face as a nation, and one in diversity.
Thank you. Dr. Chandler?
So I think representation matters. I think access matters. And, a space like this, it's important that the histories of all of the people of this country, it can't just be specialized knowledge, right? It can't just be knowledge that you access in an Ivy Tower, right? Or from, some elite institution. It needs to be available and accessible to everyone. And I think about, my own experience in college and in graduate school. I was the first person in my family to go to college. And when I was working on my dissertation, I remember my grandmother, who has passed on now, but she told me that she wanted to read my dissertation. And so that was something that I kept in mind as I was writing, right? That of course I'm writing to my committee, which I have to do, but I'm also thinking about the impact that the work that I'm doing has on my family and my community and all of the people that I come into contact with. One of the things that I love most about Juneteenth, I think it's an incredibly important holiday, and I think it's a moment that really brings us closer to uniting the ideals that we profess as a nation with what we do and how we act as a people. So I'm also appreciative of spaces like this to talk about it.
All right, Professor West, you get the last word.
On a very personal level, Juneteenth is so important to me because it simply reminds me of the deep resilience of Black people, of how in the worst of circumstances, because like who celebrates that they spent 2 years enslaved before they found out they were free? And I'm being humorous in a way on that. You celebrated because you have survived, and that instead of looking back, you take that moment and you look forward and you create joy out of it. I believe the history of Black people in this country has been a historical example of how to create joy, how to find joy, how to love each other in some of the worst circumstances. And it's these kind of moments, a moment like Juneteenth, that calls on us to just take a second and remember that.
All right, amen. Thank you all so much for being part of Closer Look Live, first ever live broadcast. Thank you so much. We also have an extra added bonus, because if you think our history is something, we're going to teach you about Canada's Emancipation Day, which they just recognized for the first time last year, so that's going to be interesting too. So that's the Fireside Chat. Thank you all so much on behalf of WABE. Hi everyone, this is an extended bonus of our Closer Look Open Live Access. It's we call our Fireside Chat. And when we were putting the whole program together, we were talking with our good friends at the Canadian Consulate, and they said, Rose, Canada has a very interesting history too as it relates to emancipation of its Black citizens. It got me to thinking, I think in terms of history, we've always been told a lot of Black folks that went to Canada and then they were free and all was well. But no, it didn't happen like that. So they, on behalf of the Canadian Consulate, they were generous enough to sponsor this Fireside Chat, and I am honored because she's kind of like my Canadian counterpart, although she's much taller, as y'all can see, and has more fabulous shoes than I do. But B is an outstanding author, journalist, historian, writer, radio personality, mom extraordinaire. So please welcome B. Kwame. let's begin, because last year was the first year that Canada officially recognized its emancipation. I think a lot of people, I was surprised because I was thinking Canada had to go through a recognition for it. Give us the backstory here on that.
So, long story short, what a lot of people, and this is including a lot of Canadians as well, didn't realize or don't realize that Canada has its own history of enslavement. From about 1600 till 1834, there was a history of enslavement throughout different parts of the country, what we now know as Ontario and Quebec areas. So we often get told the story in our own Black history lessons and things of that nature, only about the Underground Railroad, only about the fact that Canada was the North Star, was the site of freedom for those poor, African-American slaves who needed freedom. We were never told the story about enslavement that actually happened on our own lands with Black people in Canada. So in August 1st, 1834, that was when the British officially abolished and ended slavery and is known as Emancipation Day. So that affected enslaved folks who were in Canada and throughout the Caribbean, areas of South Africa as well, that were under British colonial rule. The interesting thing is the Caribbean ties in really closely with Canada as it relates to our Black populations and communities. So even though August 1st, 1834 was the official date of emancipation, that didn't mean everybody was necessarily free at that same time. Canada and certain Caribbean nations, that day, you were free, good to go. But certain islands, Jamaica is one, that's my heritage, where my parents are from, they actually entered what was considered an apprenticeship program. So that means that technically formally enslaved Black folks still had to work for another 4 years as an apprentice before they could earn their full freedom. Wow. So that wasn't until 1838. And these are stories that were never told to us in our own Canadian history lessons, and we uncover them now.
And if they didn't tell y'all, we know. Because this is the first time I'm hearing any of this.
Exactly.
In the conversation we had in the auditorium about the importance of telling the ugly truths and telling accuracy, I imagine in Canada, is it the same narrative about who gets to tell the story, at what age, and how 100%. We should tell it?
100%. I will say one thing is that for more conservative-leaning folks in Canada, they're keeping an eye on what's happening in the US. And the conversations that are happening around CRT are happening in Canada. The conversations that are happening around what should be taught, who should be taught it, what should be excluded, the same things are happening in Canada. Exact same. I'll give you a personal example. I do a lot of public speaking, especially throughout February for Black History Month. And our largest school board in Ontario, if not in Canada, the Toronto District School Board, they have implemented a new vetting process for speakers to come into the school, which I didn't necessarily have a problem with because my children go to public school. I want to make sure whoever is coming into the school to educate them beyond their educators are, valid. However, I noticed that where I used to be able to get my approvals to go into schools and talk about Black history and focus specifically on Black Canadian history, the amount of red tape, bureaucracy, hoops to jump through in order to be seen as approved to come and speak is very difficult. So I have not been able to go back into those schools. I've been able to work with other school boards, but we have those same issues burgeoning around what stories do we want to tell, what should be hidden, what's going to offend people or make certain children feel bad, what do we just want to continue to shove under the carpet, because we're Canada beside the US. The US is the ones with all that nasty history. We're Canada, we don't want to think about that. Meanwhile, we have the exact same histories happening.
Isn't that something? Yeah. Isn't that something? The parallels between Canada and the US are just remarkable.
Very much so. There's a lot, and there's a lot of connection, because even when we think about how Emancipation Day, August 1st, is celebrated in Canada, a lot of that is with support of people who came up from Detroit, Chicago, other places to areas of Windsor and other areas of southwestern Ontario, building up this celebration and making it to the point where at one time Windsor had the biggest, what was called the biggest street festival in North America at the time was the Emancipation Day Festival. And over 200,000 people were coming. That was in early 1900s. Wow. And so we have these connections of shared histories, because these are people who, either people who are seeking their freedom, who found their way through the Underground Railroad to Canada, or freed blacks who came up to Canada and created new lives and new spaces for their families, especially because our emancipation happened in 1834. There's a huge history and huge connection there. So it makes a lot of sense that there are these synergies between our stories and our histories, for sure, that I do.
In terms of sharing the truths, do you run up against people who say, and we had this conversation there, well, you know, that happened such a long time ago and we should be moving forward and it's in the past. And I've always said, you know, we should never ever tell a population or a community of people how they should deal with a past.
Exactly.
We should never tell the Jewish community how they should cope with the Holocaust or how they tell that story. We should never tell black people how to talk about, we should never tell indigenous people how to talk. So when you have this conversation and you telling people, listen, understand this is what you need to understand about these lived experiences, whether they were 200 years ago or now, and the interaction, the fact that they correlate.
Exactly.
What do you tell people?
So it's really easy, because the first thing people want to do in Canada when you talk about blackness, enslavement, history, is bring up the Underground Railroad and how that made the country look so good. And it said, well, at the same time, there's things that we need to learn about that were not so good. And it's really easy to create that moment where somebody's got to sit back and realize, oh, okay, we can't just own the good. We've got to own the rest of it too.
On a global standpoint, as we wrap up, I was reading where I believe it was Belgium, correct me if I'm wrong, that recently wanted to try to apologize for, was it King Leopold?
With the Congo, yes,
Yeah,
yes, you're
and
right.
all his shenanigans. And it got the conversation in terms of, are we in this space now where these ugly truths need to be acknowledged, recognized, apologized? What does that look like now? Particularly we talk about colonization.
Yeah.
What is your take on all of that?
I think we are going to see more of these entities, the royal family, these, you know, remnants of colonization. They're going to have to reckon with that. If we look at what happened throughout the Caribbean with the royal tour that happened recently, and the protests and uprisings and things that happened through there, with other islands deciding, Trinidad has already emancipated themselves from the British royal family. Barbados has recently done that. Jamaica is looking to do that. Other islands as well have said, we're going to start this process to become a republic and move away from British colonial rule. It's just going to be like a domino effect. So I think it's just a matter of how quickly are these things going to happen. It's not a question of if they're going to happen anymore. So I think we're going to see a lot of change in the years and decades to come with what this continued evolution of emancipation looks like. Because it always feels like you get a little bit, but you don't get it all. Then you get a little bit more. So we're still fighting that fight to get it all. And I think that's what we're going to see.
Royal families, that's a whole nother conversation. That's on the next closer look. B. Kwame, thank you so much for coming. This is your first trip to
First
Atlanta.
time in Atlanta.
Thank you.
It's
Yeah,
been
welcome to the A.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Again, thank you to the Lancaster Center and the Canadian Consulate. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.